Now, a question about Mabinogi and Mabinogion. Slight difference in spelling. Why is there a difference in spelling? Are they one and the same thing?
So it's a bit of a complicated question, but I'll try and kind of not take too long to explain this, because you could get into the history and like really elaborate on it. But essentially, there are these two words that can trip people up if they're new to Welsh mythology and Welsh magic in general. Mabinogi and then Mabinogion with the Owen at the end. Most English versions of the stories that you can buy today are usually published as Mabinogion with the Owen at the end. So that leads people to believe that that is the true name for it. But actually, the history is a bit more complicated than that. So the term Mabinogi is a bit of a mystery to us as well. We don't exactly know what it means. There are theories about what it means. There are lots and lots of theories about what it means, from really simple theories such as that it just means like juvenalities or the tales of youth. So it could be that these stories were told to young people to teach them morals, teach them values, teach them about the world. Some people think that it might be a term that essentially means like the stories of young nobility or the stories of the princes, essentially. Other people have even implied that perhaps the term Mabinogi has something to do with Mabon, who is, of course, a Welsh deity and is associated with the older Celtic deity Mabhonos, that it is the stories of Mabon, maybe. And that one of the characters in the Mabinogi, Pryderi, who is the son of Rhiannon, is actually a later medieval version of the earlier god Mabon. But again, that's kind of like out there and outlandish and such. So these are just some of the theories that people have as to what it means. But the word itself comes from the manuscript tradition that these stories are recorded within. At the end of each branch, because we refer to them as Peder Cainc y Mabinogi, the four branches of the Mabinogi, which gives us a really interesting visual of how these stories work. We can imagine this one great tree with a big tree trunk, and all of these stories inhabit this tree, and that they just branch off into four primary branches that come off of that great tree. So they're all connected, and yet they all have their own branch as well. So the four branches of the Mabinogi. And where we get that whole idea and the term Mabinogi in general is at the end of each individual story in the manuscripts, they end with the term Ac felly terfyna'r gainc hon o'r Mabinogi, which translates to, and thus ends this branch of the Mabinogi. So it's essentially a way of saying, this is where this story ends. Now we're moving on to another. And we get this term, Mabinogi, which implies that all of these stories are connected and part of the same series. But at the end of the
there's always a but.
Yeah, there's always a but. At the end of the first branch of the Mabinogi, I believe it is, in one of the manuscripts, rather than Ac felly terfyna'r gainc hon o'r Mabinogi, thus ends this branch of the Mabinogi, it says, and thus ends this branch of the Mabinogion. So it's a bit of a complicated one, because what happened was, so prior to the 18th century, the broader world outside of Wales didn't really care about these stories. They didn't think they were of any interest, of any intrigue. But luckily in the 18th century, there was a huge uprise in the romanticization of ancient cultures and mythologies. And so it brought the perfect storm, which enabled people to look into these stories and go, okay, the world is ready to read these now. The world is ready to receive these stories. So a few people went on a mission to translate them from the Middle Welsh into English. One of the first people to do this was a Welsh scholar from the 18th century called William Owen Pughe. But William Owen Pughe, he was Welsh, and he was approaching these tales from a very native perspective. But he had one problem when he was translating them, and that was that he was an absolutely terrible writer. So he had no grammar skills. He didn't know how to make the stories interesting or intriguing. So his translations were like literal translations from the Welsh into the English. And so a lot of publishers had no interest in it. And unfortunately, on top of that, before he could fully finalize and complete it all and send it into a publisher, he died. So it never saw the light of day. But under his kind of tutelage and under like the same studies as he was conducting came a woman called Lady Charlotte Guest, which I have to be careful because I always accidentally say Charlotte Church there. It wasn't Charlotte Church, Lady Charlotte Guest.
Slightly different.
Slightly different. I wouldn't put it past Charlotte Church to do a version of the Mabinogi.
Well, no, not at all.
But Charlotte Guest. So Lady Charlotte Guest came along and she was quite an interesting person. She had a love for languages, she had a love for ancient cultures, and she had a love specifically for Wales, even though she herself was English. So she came along and she took the work of William Owen Pughe and she took the Mabinogi and the stories that we have recorded in the manuscript and she worked on her own translations. And luckily for us, she was a brilliant writer. She managed to make these stories captivating and current and contemporary, and yet still keeping that spirit of the stories alive for the most part. There are some little issues with her, but not completely entirely. And we're very thankful to her because she made these stories accessible for the broader world by translating them into English. And when William Owen Pughe and Lady Charlotte Guest were both translating these stories, they worked under the assumption that Mabinogi was a singular word that represented one single story, whereas Mabinogion was a plural for more than one story. So it's almost like you're saying a Mabinogi and a Mabinogis, like more than one. So when they went to put a title on the cover of their book, they decided to go with Mabinogion to try and imply plurality. The issue with that, and what we discovered with later scholarship and such, is that that is not how the Welsh language works. So the word Mabinogi, without the O-N on the end, is already plural. So it doesn't need to be pluralized. So then started this mission of like, what is this word and what does it actually mean? So people started looking into it and they realized that at the end of the same branch, just above where they would have written Mabinogion, there was another word that also ended in that yon sound, which was dyledegion, which means like the noble people and such. And this word is quite up there, so it's not that they were trying to rhyme it or anything because it's like a bit far up the page, but it is there and it's very prominent. So the theory now, which is quite funny really to think about, is that essentially these manuscripts were written out by hand over numerous days, weeks and months by very tired, very hardworking monks and scribes. And so the theory now is that one night, you know, as the candlelight was
I know where you're going with this.
as this monk was getting tired, as he was like finishing up his manuscript and he was like, I'm so close to finishing, he looked up at the word dyledegion, and as he was writing the last word, he accidentally added an O-N because he was looking at that dyledegion. So essentially, the theory now is that it's a scribal error.
It's a spelling mistake.
Yes. So the theory is that it's a scribal error. The theory is that it's not a proper word that ever like meant anything really, that the true proper word is Mabinogi. But it stuck because of people like William Owen Pughe and Charlotte Guest, who came and they took that term and they published their popular, well, Charlotte Guest published her popular version of it, which went to the broader world. And so when people published new versions of it, they stuck with that term because it was recognizable, but it kind of helped to fix a problem that we had in the study of Welsh mythology as well. Because what eventually happened was they realized that maybe that term is more useful than we think, because the term Mabinogi technically only refers to four stories within these manuscripts. That's the four branches of the Mabinogi: Pughe, the prince of Dyfed, Branwen, the daughter of Llyr, Manawydan, the son of Llyr, and Math, the son of Mathonwy. Those are the Mabinogi proper. But if you purchase a copy of the Mabinogi today, you'll notice that there's usually more than four stories included. There's usually the four branches, and then there's around 7 or 8 stories on top of that, making it 11 or 12 stories in total. And the other stories that are usually included are part of the same kind of manuscript tradition, but they don't have that term at the end that says, and thus ends this branch of the Mabinogi. They're not part of that same seriality. And so there's been lots of attempts over the years to come up with like, what do we call these stories in comparison to the Mabinogi? You've got 4 branches of the Mabinogi and then these other stories. Is there not a term we can use which covers them all?
The others.
The others beyond the branches. And so when people do talk about that, they go, well, you know, we can call them the native tales and the romances and the Mabinogi, but that's so complicated then you have to add all these different terms. So now, in most modern scholarship, the term Mabinogi, with just the I at the end, is used to denote what it truly means, which is the 4 branches of the Mabinogi.
Right.
Whereas when you add the ON to the end, you're talking about the 4 branches of the Mabinogi and these other
And the
7
others.
or 8 stories, depending on the version you read. So it's become an umbrella term for all of the Welsh manuscript literary mythological tradition, essentially.